Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. We've been going through the Ten Commandments, and they're something like wedding vows. They're the commitments of God and His people coming together in the desert. The first two commandments: no other gods before me, and an exclusive relationship with Israel's God, and don't represent God using anything within creation. Now, this document is, although you can find things like Hammurabi's Code and other ancient law texts and other texts that are often compared to it, there's really nothing quite similar. There's a flow to this. There's a reasonable order and a community that's created, and I think this is part of the reason that the Ten Commandments continue to have really an enduring reputation in our culture. Now, during this week, I made a video for the church channel, which I also released on my own personal channel. Which Bible translation, and so I'm doing a series of videos on introduction to the Bible, and so hopefully I think I'll probably do one a week. That's probably the pace that I'll go. And people often ask me, well, what English translation of the Bible should they use? And one of the things that'll come through when we start diving deeper into the Third Commandment is the King James Version and some of the qualities of it, and won't really talk about some of the shortcomings of it now, almost 500 years later, over 500 years later. So it's a pretty important document, and we'll get into a little bit of translation as we get into this. So the heir of the King James, Bible translations usually sort of go in families. And so they're the King James Version, and the heir of the King James Version was the Revised Standard Version, and then the New Revised Standard Version. And so the Revised Standard Version is pretty much the same wording as the King James Bible. You should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. The New Revised Standard Version went like this: You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. And you see very much that misuse starts to come into the frame. Now, take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I remember listening to this as a child and thinking, what does that mean? Take the name in vain. The NIV, which is a translation that was started at least partly by the prompting of the Christian Reformed Church in the 1970s, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone who misuses his name. So that word misuse. But what is use and misuse? It doesn't seem entirely clear from any of the translations. Now, what we saw in the previous commandment was you shall not bow down to these images that you make, nor serve them or worship them. And so it's some pretty clear and specific physical items in the prohibition. Now, as a child, I grew up thinking about the Third Commandment in this way: don't use God's name, the word God or Lord or Jesus, as a cuss word or as an exclamation. And I think if we would pause, it's very, very common, obviously. If we'd pause to think about why we would use these words as exclamations or as cuss words, it's really quite an interesting psychological tradition. You could use, as I was taught, you could go to court and use "So help me God" and these types of oaths for public oaths, and that was, I think, very much sort of the application within the Christian Reformed Church in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. Now, if you look at the history of interpretation in this Third Commandment, there's usually three dominant understandings of why. Again, we'll have to get into exactly what is prohibited here, but careful use of God's name is to protect the Lord's reputation. Don't use the Lord's name in divination. That's an interpretation that seemed to come a little bit later, people understanding that names could be used in divination, and really, I think partly in the modern frame, this continued fear and suspicion of magic and those kinds of things, and then also for legal oaths. Now, dominant in my upbringing was the Heidelberg Catechism, which is one of the confessional documents of the Christian Reformed Church. What's interesting is that there are actually 2 Lord's Days devoted to this commandment, which is rather striking because most of the commandments get 1, and this one gets 2. Well, why? Well, usually, as in with many things with the Heidelberg Catechism, it has a lot to do with what was going on at the time that the Catechism was written. What is the aim of the Third Commandment? That we neither blaspheme nor misuse the name of God by cursing, perjury, or unnecessary oaths, nor share in such horrible sins by being silent bystanders. In summary, we should use the holy name of God only with reverence and awe, so that we may properly confess God, pray to God, and glorify God in all our words and works. And you can see right there, proper use versus misuse. That's dealing with, but also the broadening of God's reputation and our relationship to God with respect to that reputation. Question and answer 100. Is blasphemy of God's name by swearing and cursing really such a serious sin that God is angry also with those who do not do all they can to help prevent and forbid it? And this puts pretty large onus on others standing alongside. Yes, indeed, no sin is greater. I don't know that people would think about that today. No sin is greater or provokes God's wrath more than blaspheming his name. That is why God commanded it to be punished with death. Now, one of the interesting things, if you go through the Heidelberg Catechism, is you can find this on the Christian Reformed Church website, and you'll have these little footnote numbers. I don't always include them in the slides, but the footnote numbers are not original to the Catechism. And one of the interesting observations is that over the centuries that the Catechism has been used, often the text cited as justification for elements of the Catechism questions and answers have changed. And it's very interesting. So I looked up Leviticus 5 and Leviticus 24, and these passages are very Levitical in terms of it's very much continues to be a world in which God will take active measures to address and protect his name. And this leads to, in the modern era, a lot of joking about, lightning strikes and things like that. But it's very interesting to me which passages were cited as support for this question and answer. And then again, as I mentioned, there are 2 Lord's Days that are devoted to this commandment. But may we swear an oath in God's name if we do so reverently? Yes. When the government demands it or when necessity requires it. It doesn't spell out what those necessities are. In order to maintain and promote truth and trustworthiness for God's glory and our neighbor's good, such oaths are grounded in God's word. And in fact, you can find them in the Bible in many places. And were rightly used by the people of God in the Old and New Testament. You find Paul fulfilling an oath in the book of Acts. Obviously, oaths were taken, and so the Heidelberg Catechism says it may be used. It may be used by government. Now, it's very interesting that certain elements of the Radical Reformation denied this and very much wanted it resisted. And a little bit later, we'll read Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount on oath taking. May we also swear by saints or other creatures? No. A legitimate oath means calling upon God as the only one who knows my heart, to witness to my truthfulness and to punish me if I swear falsely. No creature is worthy of such honor. Now, I think, as we're going to get into it, this question and answer, I think, really gets at the heart of what this specific commandment is addressing. Now, as I said before, I've been paying attention to translations, and one of the ancient translations that is really vitally important in biblical interpretation and understanding is called the Septuagint, and it was translated in the 1st century before Christ in Alexandria, Egypt, by a group of 70 Jewish scholars. Now, hence you have the NIV, the RSV, the KJV, you have the NRSV, which is 4 letters but the LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, is often the sign given for the Septuagint. Now, so one of the things that I wanted to look at in studying this is, okay, well, let's see how these scholars in the first century before Christ translated this text themselves. You shall not take up the name of the Lord your God. Now, then you have a preposition. And Greek prepositions, if you're watching the video, there's a little chart here about a handy way to sort of understand these Greek prepositions in terms of spatial use. And it uses the word epi, which is upon. Well, that's interesting. You shall not take up the name of the Lord your God upon, and then it's going to be upon something. And now, as you can see in the English translation, the second half of the verse very much mirrors the first half of the verse. But upon what? Now, and it gets into this Mataios word, or Mataio, which is a very interesting word, and we'll get a little bit into the Hebrew that it translates. But so if you do a search of the Septuagint, you find it shows up in interesting places like this one in Kings. Now, you always have to be a little careful with translations of the Septuagint, that they're translating the Septuagint, because most of your contemporary Bibles are translating the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. And it's talking about these kings of Israel that weren't particularly good, because of all the kings of Baasha and his son Elah had committed and had caused Israel to commit. So they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. That worthless, that's this word. Well, that's interesting. And the fact that it's tied to idolatry is important. Next, another verse. He followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their, again, worthless idols. And in fact, what happens here in the Old Testament often is that there are words that the Old Testament regularly used to talk about these idols and to demote these idols and to denounce these idols, and worthless or vain is one of it. What is it? A vain hope is a hope that is no hope at all. It's merely for show. Vanity of vanities, the book of Ecclesiastes says. So now if we get into the Masoretic text, if you're looking at the video, you'll notice that the text goes from right to left, and this is an interlinear, so it sort of gives words that are kind of associated with the Hebrew words. You shall not lift up the name of the Lord, your God. And then if you're reading along, it's like, well, to the vanity. Well, what does that mean? You shall not lift up the name of the Lord your God to the vanity. And it almost sounds like something from the first commandment or from the second commandment, because it's very closely associated with pagan idolatry and other gods. And of course, it gets repeated at the end. Because the Lord will not leave unpunished he who lifts up. And here's the second of it. You've got this lifting up motion as a part of this command. Now, again, the NIV and the NRSV and a lot of contemporary translations sort of give up on all that and attempt to communicate. So misuse. But misuse doesn't really give you a lot of idea. Well, what exactly is proper use and misuse? And of course, the Heidelberg Catechism talked about prayer, worship, and then opened the door to these oaths. Now, if you watched The Lion King, or if you watched Roots, there are these powerful scenes in these movies where infants are lifted up. And in Roots, there was this little ceremony, behold the only thing greater than yourself, and they lift up a baby. Well, you can kind of think about that and think about what was being said in that. But what does it mean to lift up or to take up? It's sort of a means of putting something up to God. All right? Of lifting it up to God, of presenting it to God. And things like this can happen in a sacrificial context. Things like this can happen in a ceremonial context. So we're lifting something upon vanity. We're lifting something you shall not lift up to the vanity. What are we talking about? Well, the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, often when I go through and work on sermons, If I'm doing a series, I'll focus on one particular commentary or commentary series, and lately I've been looking at this commentary because it tends to go into other cultural backgrounds that have some association with what's going on in these texts. And misuse the name, again, that doesn't tell us too much. Based on this verse, it has been traditional for many Jews to avoid even saying the name the Lord, instead of saying Adonai, Lord Master, Hashem, the name. Complete non-use of the name precludes any misuse. But in the ancient world, this statement would have carried a legal connotation. A literal rendering is, you shall not lift the name of the Lord your God to falsehood. This is this vanity. Okay. The idiom lift the name refers to oath-taking. Well, that seems to make sense. The ancient Near East had two types of oaths, promissory oaths and judicial oaths. In the former, a person swore to complete some specified action in the future. The judicial oath was taken more seriously and typically occurred in the context of a trial. When a trial court was unable to reach a verdict based on a lack of evidence, it often required one of the parties to take a judicial oath. In this oath, the party swore by one or more gods that his or her version of the events was indeed true. If the party followed the court's oath order and took the oath, that party automatically won the trial. So these oaths were pretty important. But now we've talked in other sermons about ordeals. Oh, what's an ordeal? An ordeal is, well, you throw somebody into a river to see if they're a witch. It's a Monty Python ordeal, kind of mocking certain things in the Middle Ages. The fiery furnace in the book of Daniel was an ordeal. The test of food was an ordeal. There are all these, the lion's den was an ordeal. And basically the idea is that you do something and let God sort it out, and God is going to express himself through the historical events that unfold. And the idea here is, if you don't have enough evidence to determine guilt or innocence one way or another, or between two parties, somebody takes an oath, and it's in a sense like an ordeal, and saying, here, I'm lifting it up to God. Well, you'd better be telling the truth, because the Lord will not hold him guiltless who lifts up his name over upon a vain thing, neither upon an idol, nor upon a lie or an untruth. The prohibition in the Third Commandment likely targets those who might swear false judicial oaths in the name of the Lord, to lie under oath, as it were. And what the commandment says is, if you do this, God himself will repay. So we've got commandments 1 through 3, and in many ways they form a set. No other gods before me. Don't represent me by using anything within my creation. No little statues or images or paintings or these things to represent God, because the Creator cannot be depicted or represented by the creation, even though the Creator expresses himself through the creation. Don't lift up my name upon any vain thing, okay, or upon any vain idol or image. Use my name to swear a lie, to fool your neighbor. I will hold you to your word. Part of what this gets into is presence. And I know right now Americans are bugging themselves with Amazon Echoes and Google Homes and Android smartphones, and they're listening all the time. And it's almost as if, okay, if you invoke his name and make him your witness, he'll take it seriously. And you will notice that, in fact, these traditions come all the way to the present time, that you'll have presidential nominees swearing an oath of office on a Bible, raising their hand, so help me God. And the idea is, well, if you're not telling the truth, if you're not sincere, God himself will hold you to your oath. Do you believe that? One of the things that we know with all of these commandments is our inability to keep them. And the Israelites in chapter 19 swore the people all. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of Israel and set them before all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. It doesn't mean they were insincere. We as human beings often have a capacity or a lack of capacity to follow through, and the temptation to use God's name to prop up our reputation, to get ahead in the market, to do one thing or another. That's what this commandment is talking about. And God says, I'm paying attention. I won't look away. Jesus, in fact, in some ways, as is common in the Sermon on the Mount, even strengthens this. And this is part of the reason that certain Christian groups will refuse to even take oaths in government or court. Again, you have heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. And again, there's the promissory oaths and the judicial oaths. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your own head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Now pay attention. Notice here, the point of swearing an oath is you are pointing to someone else who will act basically in history through events to reveal the truth or the lie and to make good on the promise. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And again, this sets up a big discussion in terms of, well, should Christians use these oaths formally? On one hand, they're used throughout the Old and New Testament, as the Heidelberg Catechism says. On the other hand, you have the saying of Jesus that has led many Christians to say, I'm not going to do it, not even for the government. And then we have Jesus on the cross. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. The Gospel of Matthew is translating Jesus, who is using a translation of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far off from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Now, this is not technically speaking a vow, but in a sense, it comes close to it in some ways, because he is appealing to God for rescue and asking God, why aren't you rescuing me? Well, why didn't he rescue him? We believe he wasn't being rescued because he was receiving the punishment that we deserve. Now, how are we to take this commandment? The three dominant understandings, they differ, but I don't think they're far off. Protect the Lord's reputation. We ought to do that. Don't use the Lord's name in divination or really to promote our own causes. I think that's clear. And legal oaths. And again, I think Christians can differ on whether or not this is proper for us to do. The opinion of my tradition has been it is proper for us to do. Other traditions have said no. Again, as a child watching this, I very much had the idea that don't use God's name as a cuss or a word. Don't use it lightly. And I think that's important. I think it's important to restrain our speech and to not use God's name as simply an expression, or certainly not as a way to cuss. Can you use it in public vows? Well, Christians will differ on that. I think the heart of it, however, is the name and the promise of the name. And what we see in Jesus is the curse falls upon him. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, this remembering him isn't merely a psychological thing. In a sense, when we live out his way, we remember his body comes together. Remember, we are his members. We remember Jesus in the world. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. This is how Jesus is to be remembered in our midst. This is how his reputation is to be formed. This is how he lives in the midst of our lives.